What happens when a war is declared necessary? But the hardest question comes after the bombs fall. In this tense congressional exchange, Representative Adam Smith presses Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth on the one issue that matters more than any slogan, any strike, or any press statement. Did this war actually improve the nuclear threat from Iran? Or did it simply create a more dangerous version of the same crisis? What begins as a hearing about costs and military action quickly turns into something more unsettling. A clash over whether force delivered a solution, or only bought time while the real strategic problem remained alive beneath the rubble.
Questions he may have.
Thank you. Mr. Hurst, drag you into the conversation here. We have not yet received from the Pentagon the costs of the war. So just for the record, we'd like to get that as soon as possible. Certainly the munitions expended, but also underreported is we've had a fair amount of equipment destroyed, including 2 C-130s with the rescue of our downed airmen. So do you have either A, a cost estimate coming to us anytime soon, or B, a specific supplemental request?
Thank you for that question. So approximately at this day, we're spending about $25 billion on Operation Epic Fury. Most of that is in munitions. There's part of that it's obviously O&M and equipment replacement. We will formulate a supplemental through the White House that will come to Congress once we have a full assessment of the cost of the conflict.
Sure. So you're saying the full cost at this point is $25 billion?
Yeah, that's our estimate for the cost.
Okay. Interesting, because I'm glad you answered that question, because we've been asking for a hell of a long time, and no one's given us the number. So if you could get those details over to us, that would be great. Mr. Secretary, you mentioned the nuclear aspect of Iran and the war. And it is worth noting that every president prior to this one, including President Trump in his first term, also prevented Iran from getting a nuclear weapon without actually having to go to war in Iran. So we need to keep that in mind. But also, since the war started, Iran's nuclear arsenal has not been weakened in any way. And at the moment, in negotiations, what Iran is saying, basically pay us to open up the Strait. That's their position, which is completely untenable. I agree. It's worth noting, of course, that the Strait was open before the war started. Now we're negotiating to get back to status quo. And Iran's most recent offer is to say, we'll talk about nukes later. So what is the plan to actually turn all of this lethal kinetic action into an improvement in the nuclear situation? Because we haven't gotten there yet. Play it out for us. How does that happen? How does it actually lead to that result?
Well, I would take issue with the premise of the question that nothing was done. Operation Midnight Hammer was a very effective.
Well, I didn't say nothing was done. I said in this war.
Ultimately,
this war started.
Well, this under this administration, unlike other administrations, which cut bad deals and pallets of cash with no ability to oversee whether Iran is actually pursuing a nuclear program.
Which is where
if we want to litigate JCPOA or the Iran deal, our view, the president's view, is that was a very bad deal.
Okay.
That gave them a bunch of money up front.
What's the future?
To fund, you talked about negotiated deals. Allowed them to fund their proxies and spread Hamas and Hezbollah all around the region, build up nuclear capabilities.
That's great. What are we going to do now?
President Trump has been clear-eyed, from the killing of Qasem Soleimani to the pulling out of the Iran deal to Midnight Hammer and now to this effort to recognize that you have to stare down this kind of enemy who's hell-bent on getting a nuclear weapon and get them to a point where they're at the table giving it up in a way that ensures they never have it.
So they haven't broken yet. Okay, we haven't gotten there yet. For all of the
well, their nuclear facilities have been obliterated. Underground, they're buried, and we're watching them 24/7. So we know where any nuclear material
reclaiming
might be.
My time for
we're
just
watching
a quick second here. We had to start this war, you just said, 60 days ago, because the nuclear weapon was an imminent threat. Now you're saying that it was completely obliterated?
They had not given up their nuclear ambitions, and they had a conventional shield of thousands of missiles.
So Operation Midnight Hammer accomplished nothing of substance. It left us at exactly the same place we were before. So much so that
their facilities were bombed and obliterated. Their ambitions continued, and they're building a conventional shield.
All right, let me try again.
It's the North Korea strategy. You know this very well. The North Korea strategy was use conventional missiles to prevent anybody from challenging them so they could slow walk their way to a weapon. President Trump saw Iran at its weakest moment, took an action to ensure, in a way that only the United States of America could do with our Israeli partners,
and yet
to ensure their conventional shield was brought to
one other
heel,
question,
which we've done.
if I could get to it. So on Ukraine, a year plus ago, your advice, the president's advice, was Ukraine had no cards to play. they should go cut the best possible deal they could. Clearly that was wrong. What did you miss? What did you miss about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine that you didn't see that Ukraine was going to be capable of doing what they've done in the last 14 months?
What we didn't miss, and we're here in this committee, is that Joe Biden, with no accountability, gave hundreds of billions of dollars of our weapons to Ukraine, to an outcome that never would have happened if President Trump was president. So he pulled out our, you guys don't talk about that. Ultimately, President Trump believes there should be a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. That serves
but you
the best
didn't expect
interests of both
Ukraine
parties.
to be where they're at right now. I'm asking you, just from a strategic standpoint, what
I
did
think the
you miss?
Ukrainians have shown great courage, and I appreciate that Europe is now paying for any weapons that we provide.
All right, I yield back. Thank you. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate those opening remarks. I want to start by agreeing with you on the last point. Our troops have performed incredibly well in the last 15 months. They have been asked to do more than anyone expected, and they have demonstrated the incredible capability of the United States military. I think we should all recognize that. Even if we question the strategy, some of the decisions behind it, our troops deserve nothing but our praise for the incredible job that they have done. It has not been perfect. Certainly mistakes have been made, but we have demonstrated to the world that we have a highly capable military. And I hear the chairman on the need for an increased budget. I think there's a whole lot of needs across the United States of America that would have the same attitude about health care, about education, about infrastructure. But the problem is we have a $40 trillion debt, and we insist on cutting taxes for absolutely everybody, so we reduce the amount of revenue that is available to that. We also have to have a national security strategy that lives within a sound fiscal picture. Most experts would say that the most profound threat to our national security right now is exactly that. Is our fiscal picture. How are we going to continue to be able to afford to fund the things we need to fund as we run the debt ever higher? The other thing worth worrying about is the Pentagon has not yet passed an audit. If we give them what is roughly a 50 to 60% increase, is that money going to be well spent? We have every reason to doubt that. Now, I will say, and I praise the chairman, this committee, and in a bipartisan, bicameral way, we have tackled the problem of acquisition reform. I think last year's bill put us on a good trajectory to get to the point where we can, in fact, innovate faster at scale. I also believe the Pentagon has been working on that. We've had many meetings with Deputy Secretary Feinberg, who is focused on that, but we got a long way to go. Can the Pentagon really absorb another $500–600 billion, depending on what the supplemental and the reconciliation package are? I don't think so. We need to pay as much attention to how we're spending the money as to how much we're spending, and we never seem to do that. But the larger problem is the strategy that has been put before us. I looked through the Secretary's remarks, and I've heard you give speeches before about this, about how realism is our strategy. And I find that absurd, and given what we are doing. You can say a lot of things about the strategy, but calling it realistic? We started a full-scale war in the Middle East against Iran to try to reshape the Middle East. Now, we can talk about that in a bunch of different ways, but it is the exact opposite of realism. And in fact, starting wars in the Middle East that get out of control and lead us to have far greater costs for the benefits is one of the cornerstones of the unrealistic strategy that this administration has criticized over and over and over again. And yet here we are in a full-scale Mideast war, and we've seen the costs of that. Certainly at the top of that list is 13 service members killed and hundreds wounded, but it goes way beyond that. Thousands of civilians have been killed. Over a dozen countries now have been dragged into this war in one way or another. The Israel-Lebanon war has exploded since this war started. We now have a conflict between the Shia militias in Iraq and Kurdistan that is straining, to put it mildly, our relationship with Iraq and also causing greater chaos throughout the Middle East. We've seen the impact on the economy. Certainly here at home, gas prices up by over $1. The impact of the fertilizer increase is going to come later as food prices skyrocket. But what is happening to us is a small part of what's happening to the rest of the world. Certainly the Middle East's economy has been tossed up in the air, but dozens of countries are rationing gasoline as we speak and experiencing extreme economic pain because of this war. So there's nothing realistic about that. And one of the big questions that we need to get answered today is, where is this going? What is the plan to achieve our objectives? We've seen the cost, and the cost is very, very high. All we keep hearing on the objectives is we keep seeing all of the targets that we have struck. And again, That is an incredible accomplishment from a tactical standpoint. I think the proficiency of our military has been on display, but we're not in this for a tactical advantage. We're in this to fundamentally change Iran. And as we sit here today, Iran's nuclear program is exactly what it was before this war started. They have not lost their capacity to inflict pain. They still have a ballistic missile program. They're still able to blockade the Strait of Hormuz and have the ships that are capable of doing that. What is the plan to get that to change? And most disturbingly, the president keeps telling us that it's over. What was it, a week ago Friday, the president announced that Iran had agreed to give up their nuclear program, to give up their ballistic missile program, to stop support for terrorist groups, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The only problem with that is literally none of that was true. He was completely making it up. It wasn't. Iran hadn't even agreed to meet with us, as became embarrassingly clear as the day spun out and poor J.D. Vance had to keep going back and forth to the airport. We never even had a meeting. So wish fulfillment is not really a strategy. I mean, maybe the president thinks he's doing some sort of Jedi mind trick and can tell Iran, you will give up your nuclear weapons, and they automatically will. But that's not working. So what we need to hear today is what is going to work. We have 50,000 troops in the region who are still at risk. How are those tactical victories going to translate into some sort of strategic success? And by the way, this is one of the things that realism recognizes. You can win a whole lot of little small battles and lose the war, which is why you don't stumble into the war in the first place. But at the same time, we're doing all of this on our own, as we increasingly push away all of our allies, sometimes just because we want to do what we want to do, we don't want to have to consult them, sometimes just gratuitously insulting them. I mean, in the middle of this war where we were asking NATO to come join us, the president took time out to insult President Macron and his wife. Okay, how is that helping us to try and belittle everybody in the world? And I also, for the people who are criticizing NATO over this war, I will remind people that NATO is a defensive alliance. What that means is every country in it pledges to defend a country if attacked. And when we were attacked on 9/11, that's what NATO did. They put in Article 5, and for 20 years they fought beside us. NATO is not if any one of the countries decides to unilaterally and unwisely start a war precipitously that everyone else is supposed to join. That's not the way it works. So berating and belittling our allies after we did that and driving them ever further away from us, how is that realistic? Not only are we going to try to reshape the Middle East, but we're going to do it alone, while we're pushing everybody away from us. And then we have other tools in our arsenal. You see that those numbers on the budget, but the State Department's really important. Development is really important. These are ways to achieve our ends, and we have moved away from that. We got rid of the entire USAID, literally causing the starvation of children in countries where we had pledged to provide food, causing massive healthcare disruptions, people literally dying because we cut that off. In diplomacy, we have sidelined, again, the entire world. France and the UK have brought together 44 different countries that have an interest in trying to open up the Strait of Hormuz. We've pushed them all aside. And then we've even pushed aside our own diplomatic corps. We have a very, very talented State Department. I praise today the talent of our military, and I will stand by that. They deserve that praise. Our diplomatic corps deserves that praise too. But we've shoved them all to the side in favor of two real estate guys who are going to go negotiate all the deals in the world, which to date, by the way, has yielded exactly nothing. So there's nothing realistic about starting a war in the Middle East, going it alone, and pushing aside all diplomacy and all development and all other tools in our arsenal. And on top of that, of course, we also want to dominate the entire Western Hemisphere, including apparently annexing Canada and invading Greenland. How is any of that realistic? And then the administration comes before us and asks for what is a hopelessly unrealistic budget in this environment. Back on that chart there, when we were showing how much money we were spending on defense, we had a balanced budget. We had a surplus many years. We don't have that anymore. So call this strategy whatever you want to call it, but please don't call it realism. It's not. Forgive me, it reminds me of one of my favorite lines from A Princess Bride. It's a tense morning. I want to lighten it up a little bit. But the guy keeps saying, inconceivable, when things happen. And finally, the guy says to him, you keep using that word. I don't think you know what it means. I don't think we know what the word realism means. So please, can we not have the realism conversation? Let's have the conversation about what the strategy actually is. And I'm sure you have a different definition of it than I do. But as I look at it, the strategy seems to be to use as much violence, as much threats, as much coercion as possible to bend the world to our will. I think that is a very dangerous strategy because one of the oldest cliches in the military is the enemy gets a vote. And we may think that we can stand up and talk tough and talk about how strong we are and how we're burying our enemies and they're begging for a deal. We can do that all day long, all right? But the enemy gets a vote. They don't have to do what we tell them to do. And meanwhile, that coercive, violent strategy undermines our credibility in the world because the chairman is absolutely right. And this is one area where I strongly disagree with the folks on the far left who say that we don't really face any threats, that the U.S. is a malign influence in the world and always has been. I don't agree with that. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, variety of other transnational terrorist groups, including, yes, narco-terrorists and human traffickers over here. They all are trying to weaken us, all right? They don't want a rules-based order. They want to play by their own rules. They want to push us aside. We want to be the side that stands up for the rules. But if what we're saying to the rest of the world is stick with us because we're a better bully than China, we coerce countries more effectively, that undercuts the very message we're trying to spread to build the coalition we need to be successful. I also worry about the values that we're showing the world. When the president threatens to kill off an entire civilization, that is the message coming out of the United States of America. If we are going to be this big, powerful force that throws our weight around the world wants to know at a minimum that we're doing it for the right reasons and with a sense of values to protect people, not to destroy entire civilizations. And we all hear that and we all go, well, gosh, he probably doesn't mean it. Well, that is so reassuring, okay, that he's just making it up. We're supposed to be the United States of America. I grew up on stories of the U.S. at the end of World War II being the country that the Germans wanted to surrender to, not the Russians, because they knew they could trust our values. We don't seem to care about those values. No rules of engagement. Give them no quarter, all right? That is not who we are supposed to be. And just one final point on that. The girls' school that got hit in the first days of this war, there is absolutely no question at this point what happened. We made a mistake, and that happens in war. We identified this target based on earlier charts, and yet 2 months after it happened, we refused to say anything about it, giving the world the impression that we just don't care. We do not care about the casualties and the chaos that is caused by our war, and we should care, even if we want to prosecute that war. Now, I agree with the chairman. We need a strategy. We face the most complex threat environment that we've faced in a very, very long time. So we really want to hear from the administration. Don't give us this realism, chest-thumping stuff. What are we really going to do to meet those threats, to deal with the challenges we face? And I'll close just by saying one of the other ironies of this, of course, is we have a great example in the world right now of what our strategy should be and where our values should be, and that's Ukraine. And I'm really curious, here we are, we roll out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin. We belittle and insult President Zelensky in the White House. He has no cards, right? Well, here we are a year after that. Looks like he had a couple cards to play because Ukraine is actually winning against Russia. Ukraine, a sovereign democracy standing up against a brutal, oppressive, coercive dictatorship. And we can't even bring ourselves on a consistent basis to say, we are with Ukraine and we are against what Putin is doing, and stand up and support them. So I want to see that strategy to meet the complex threat environment that we have. But simply saying we've already won and boasting and bragging and trying to belittle and insult the entire world, that's not going to get us to the posture that we need. So I hope we have a conversation about how we can build a strategy that makes sense and is actually realistic. With that, I yield.
By the end of this exchange, the real story is no longer just about who sounded tougher, who interrupted more sharply, or who landed the better political line. The deeper story is about the gap between military action and strategic outcome. Adam Smith begins with something concrete and measurable: cost. He points out that Congress had still not fully received the Pentagon's accounting for the war, and the hearing finally produces a figure of roughly $25 billion tied to the operation, much of it in munitions and replacement costs. That opening matters because it grounds the argument in reality. Before anyone debates ideology, before anyone rewrites the purpose of the war, there is already a price: equipment lost, resources spent, another conflict added to the American ledger. But Smith does not stop at cost, because cost is not the hardest question. The hardest question is result, and that is where the hearing becomes truly compelling. He says something that shifts the entire frame. Every president before this one, including Trump in his first term, kept Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon without having to go to war in Iran. In one line, he turns the conversation from military action to strategic necessity. He is not merely asking whether the strike was powerful. He is asking whether it was needed to achieve the stated objective, and whether that objective is actually closer now than it was before the conflict. That is the moment the clip stops feeling like routine oversight and starts sounding like an indictment of unclear end states. Hegseth responds by rejecting the premise. He points to Operation Midnight Hammer as effective, attacks earlier diplomacy as weak and dangerous, and argues that Trump's approach has been clear-eyed where previous administrations cut bad deals. He says the facilities were obliterated, buried underground, and are now being watched around the clock. That answer is forceful. It is built for certainty. But what makes the exchange so strong is that Smith does not let the certainty end the discussion. He pushes back on the central contradiction. If Iran was such an imminent threat 60 days ago that war became necessary, and if its facilities have now been devastated, then what exactly has changed about the larger problem if Iran's ambitions remain intact? This is the central tension of the clip, and it is also what gives it documentary weight, because the real issue here is not whether bombs can destroy structures. Of course they can. The real issue is whether destroying structures is the same thing as changing political intent, strategic ambition, and the long-term path to a nuclear weapon. Smith's argument, at its core, is that military power may have altered the battlefield without yet proving it altered the future. And that is a much more dangerous question than whether a strike was tactically successful. It asks whether the war moved the United States closer to resolution or deeper into a cycle where destruction substitutes for strategy. The hearing becomes even more revealing because both men are, in different ways, describing the same problem from opposite directions. Hegseth's side says pressure works only when strength is undeniable, when weakness is not rewarded, and when Iran is forced into a position where it must give up its nuclear aims under overwhelming pressure. Smith's side says the pressure may be real, but the proof of success is not the blast itself. It is whether the nuclear threat is genuinely more contained, more verifiable, and more politically constrained than before. In that sense, this is not just a fight over Iran. It is a fight over how modern war is judged. Is war judged by targets hit, by facilities damaged, by enemy capacity reduced? Or is it judged by whether the underlying political danger is actually smaller afterward? That is why this clip can hold an audience so effectively. It is not a shouting match for its own sake. It is a confrontation between two standards of victory. One standard sees decisive military action as the core message. The other asks whether the message changed the reality enough to justify the cost. Then the clip expands again when Smith pivots to Ukraine. That turn is not random. It broadens the hearing from one theater to a larger concern about strategic judgment itself. He reminds Hegseth that prior advice underestimated Ukraine's resilience, and he asks what was missed. That pivot matters because it quietly suggests a pattern. If leaders can misread endurance, escalation, and political outcomes in one war, how confident should anyone be in their assumptions about another? Suddenly, the clip is no longer just about Iran's nuclear capability. It is about whether the people making the hardest national security decisions are correctly reading what happens after force is used. And that is what lifts the hearing into documentary territory. It becomes less about one policy defense and more about the credibility of strategic prediction. There's also an emotional undertone here that should not be ignored. Beneath all the language of facilities, costs, supplements, and missiles is the familiar fear of a country watching yet another conflict move from urgent necessity to lingering uncertainty. Americans have heard many versions of this before. A threat is imminent, action is required, the strike is successful, the enemy is damaged, negotiations may follow, but the final answer remains just out of reach. That pattern is part of what gives Smith's questions their force. He sounds less like someone chasing a headline and more like someone trying to force a clear explanation before the next phase becomes normalized. And that is exactly why viewers stay with a clip like this, because it taps into a larger anxiety. Not just whether the war was right, but whether anyone can clearly explain what winning now looks like. So the final takeaway is this. This hearing is not memorable because it offers closure. It is memorable because it exposes the absence of closure. Adam Smith forces into the open the hardest question any war eventually faces. Not whether force was possible, but whether force actually solved the problem it was supposed to solve. Pete Hegseth answers with confidence, deterrence, destruction, and resolve. Smith answers with cost, contradiction, and strategic doubt. Between those two visions lies the real story of this clip. A nation trying to determine whether a military success has translated into a political one or whether the rubble is simply covering a crisis that has not actually ended. And if viewers feel compelled to watch this all the way through, it is because they instinctively understand that this is the moment after the headline. The moment where slogans are no longer enough, and someone finally asks the question history always asks later: what exactly did the war change?